a heartless millionaire abandoned his wife and children to pursue wealth. 10 years later, he found himself frozen in shock when he saw her at the airport, accompanied by a boy who looked exactly like him. He immediately picked up the phone and called. James Wilson, a successful 45-year-old businessman, rushed toward his boarding gate, his steps quick and purposeful. He was dressed sharply in a tailored suit, clutching a leather briefcase, and repeatedly glanced at his shiny gold watch. Another work trip, he thought with a sigh. Despite his achievements, James couldn't shake the feeling of something missing in his life. No amount of wealth seemed to fill that void. As he moved through the airport, his attention was suddenly drawn to a woman with chestnut hair walking past, holding the hand of a young boy, around 10 years old. James froze in place, his eyes wide with shock. That face, he knew it all too well. "Grace," he whispered, hardly believing it. But it wasn't just seeing Grace that rattled him. The boy walking beside her. It was like looking into a time machine. Those same green eyes, that messy blonde hair, even his stride mirrored James's childhood self perfectly. Memory came flooding back, hitting James like a tidal wave. He saw a version of himself from a decade ago, slipping out of the apartment he shared with Grace, leaving behind a cold, emotionless note on the kitchen counter. Grace had been fast asleep, completely unaware that her world was about to fall apart. James's knees felt weak. Could it be? Panic gripped him. Was Grace pregnant when he left? Guilt washed over him. Had he unknowingly abandoned not just Grace, but also a son he had never known? His pulse quickened as he started moving toward them, his mind racing. He had to talk to them to figure out what was going on. But the bustling airport crowd surged between them. James pushed through the sea of people, desperate to catch up. He called out, "Grace!" But the noise around him drowned out his voice. By the time he broke through the crowd, Grace and the boy were gone. Frantically, he scanned the area, but there was no trace of them. "Sir, are you okay?" a flight attendant asked, noticing his frantic state. James barely registered her voice. His phone buzzed. It was Rachel, his wife. He let it ring, still scanning the area, hoping to catch a glimpse of Grace and the boy. "Sir, your flight is about to leave," the flight attendant gently reminded him. James glanced at her, then back to the gate, and finally around the terminal. In that brief moment, he made a choice that would alter the course of his life forever. "No," he muttered. "I'm not getting on," he said, barely paying attention to her reaction. The flight attendant was taken aback, but James was already walking away, with a resolute look in his eyes. He couldn't just leave. He needed answers. Stepping outside the airport, he waved down a taxi. "Take me downtown," he instructed, while his thoughts raced. As the cab merged with the bustling traffic of Chicago, James pulled out his phone. He ignored Rachel's missed calls and dialed the number of an old friend, a private investigator. "Fred, it's James," he said, when Fred picked up. "I need your help finding someone," James quickly explained, providing what little he remembered about Grace. His thoughts kept circling back to the boy. Was that his son? A knot of guilt, curiosity, and an unshakable dread formed in his chest. James sensed his life was about to be turned upside down. For the first time in years, his wealth and success felt meaningless. What truly mattered now was finding Grace and that child, and somehow making amends for the mistake he made a decade ago. As the taxi rolled through the busy streets, James's mind drifted back to that night 10 years ago in New York. He'd been there for business, trying to secure a major contract. After a long day of dead-end meetings, he found himself at the hotel bar, ordering a drink. That's when Rachel appeared, confident, stunning, with a smile that hinted at adventure. "Tough day?" she asked, taking the seat next to him. That conversation christened the beginning of everything. Rachel, an executive with deep connections, talked about wealth and influence in a way that made James feel insignificant, but craving for more. Over the following months, James found reasons to extend his business trips. Every rendezvous with Rachel fueled his addiction to her charm and the world of luxury and success she offered. "You deserve more, James," Rachel would often say. "With the right crowd, you could easily become a millionaire." James couldn't help but compare his quiet life with Grace to the glitzy lifestyle Rachel was promising. Grace, a devoted teacher and loving wife, seemed out of touch with his bigger dreams. "Why do you need more?" she would ask. "Aren't we content as we are?" But James craved much more. His inner turmoil grew stronger every day. Although he loved Grace, his hunger for wealth and status overtook him. Rachel embodied everything he thought he wanted: success, influence, and admiration. On a brisk autumn evening, James made a decision that would forever alter the course of several lives. After Grace drifted off to sleep, he packed a suitcase and left behind a short, emotionless note. "Grace, I can't keep living like this. I need more from life than what we have. Please don't come looking for me." With ambition clouding his judgment and his heart heavy, James walked out of their apartment without a second glance. His unshed tears stung as he drove toward the airport, bound for a new beginning with Rachel. Little did he know, just days after his departure, Grace would discover she was pregnant. Alone and heartbroken, she clung to the pregnancy test, sobbing for hours, unsure of how to navigate life without him. The weight of his prior decisions now consumed James as he rode in a Chicago taxi. How had he been so self-centered, so blind? "We're here, sir," the taxi driver's voice interrupted his thoughts. James stepped out, finding himself outside his friend Detective Fred's office. With shaking hands, he paid the driver and got out. "I have to find them," James muttered to himself, resolved. Inside Fred's cluttered office, James spilled everything: the airport meeting, his growing doubts, and his desperate need for answers. "Do you realize what you're doing, James?" Fred asked, concerned. "This could turn your whole life upside down." "I know," James replied, raking his fingers through his hair. "But I have to do this. I need to make things right." Fred sighed, but started jotting down notes. "I'll need more information about Grace, her last known address, her job, anything that could give us a trail." James shut his eyes, guilt stabbing at him with every thought of Grace. "She's a teacher," he began, his voice shaky. "She taught at an elementary school on the north side of the city." Our place was quiet. As James shared details, his phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Rachel was persistent, but he kept brushing her off. "This is going to take some time," Fred cautioned. "I'll need a few days to pull together solid evidence." James nodded, feeling both nervous and impatient. "Do whatever's necessary. Money's not an issue." As he stepped out of Fred's office, James realized how lost he felt in the middle of Chicago. The city, once familiar and welcoming, now seemed distant and cold. He had money, success, and everything he thought he wanted. But right then, he would give anything to go back and fix his mistakes. With the past weighing heavy and the future uncertain, James knew what he had to do. Finding Grace and the child was now his only goal. He just hoped he wasn't too late. Over the next few days, James stayed in a Chicago hotel, waiting anxiously for word from Fred. Sleep was elusive, his mind tormented by thoughts of Grace and the boy who might be his son. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Grace woke up early like always. The small home she shared with Noah was quiet, except for the faint sound of cartoons in the background. "Noah, breakfast," she called, setting a plate of pancakes on the table. A 10-year-old boy with messy blonde hair dashed into the kitchen. "Pancakes," Grace smiled, ruffling his already wild hair. Her smile wavered for a second as she was reminded once again how much Noah looked like James. While Noah ate, Grace found herself lost in thought. The years after James left were brutal. Pregnant and alone, she fought to keep her teaching job as her belly grew. A memory flashed. Grace, 8 months pregnant, crying on the bathroom floor. Unpaid bills spread all around her. The fear of what was coming overwhelmed her. Back in the present, Grace shook off the painful thoughts. "We made it, didn't we, baby?" she whispered to Noah, though he was too focused on his pancakes to hear her. The doorbell rang. It was Chris, Grace's boyfriend for the past 2 years. A kind man, always smiling and with gentle eyes. "Morning, you two," Chris said, walking in and giving Grace a kiss and Noah a hug. Grace felt a rush of gratitude. Chris had become a true blessing in their lives, treating Noah as if he were his own. Across the city, James received his first bit of news from Fred. "She's still living in the same area, James," Fred mentioned during their phone call. In a small house on Maple Street, James's heart pounded. So close, after all these years. "And the boy?" he asked, his voice filled with anticipation. "Yeah, she's got a son. Noah, 10 years old. He goes to the local school," Fred responded. From what Fred had learned, Grace had been raising Noah by herself since day one. The realization hit James hard, almost knocking the wind out of him. It was true. He had a son, a child he had never known, who had grown up without a father. Fred continued, "There's more. Grace has been seeing someone for a couple of years now. His name's Chris. Seems like he's pretty involved in their lives." A wave of jealousy swept through James, catching him off guard. Who was he to feel jealous? Meanwhile, in a luxurious mansion just outside Chicago, Rachel was fuming, pacing back and forth. James hadn't returned her calls in days. First, he missed that crucial flight. Now, he was completely unreachable. "Something's not right," she muttered, her mind racing with possibilities. Back at Grace's house, the typical morning buzz carried on. Chris was helping Noah with his backpack while Grace packed his lunch. "Don't forget we have dinner with my parents tonight," Chris gently reminded her. Grace nodded with a smile, but something unsettled lingered beneath the surface. Ever since she saw that man at the airport, a man who bore an uncanny resemblance to James, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. Meanwhile, James was driving slowly down Maple Street, his heart nearly stopping when he spotted the house Fred had mentioned. A swing in the yard, a bike leaning against the porch. He parked across the street, just watching. What could he possibly say? How would he explain his absence? How could he ever ask for forgiveness after 10 long years? Just then, the front door opened. Grace stepped out, just as beautiful as he remembered, followed by Noah, and the man James guessed was Chris. They were laughing, like a perfect family on their way to school. James slumped in his seat, overwhelmed with guilt, regret, jealousy, and fear. But beneath all that, a new determination was building. He had to find a way back into their lives. He had to see his son. He had to try and fix what had been broken so long ago. But how could he do that without disrupting the happiness that Grace and Noah seemed to have built? In the days following, James found himself unable to stay away from Maple Street. He parked his car a few houses down and observed the daily rhythm of Grace's household. Each time he caught a glimpse of Noah, his heart ached. One sunny afternoon, James finally gathered enough courage to step out of his car. He walked on the sidewalk across the street, trying to appear casual, just as Grace came out to water her plants. Their eyes met. The water can slip from Grace's hands, spilling water on the pavement. "James," she breathed, shocked. Before he could get a word out, Grace crossed the street, her eyes flashing with anger. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice shaking. James stammered, "Grace, I saw you at the airport, with Noah. Don't you dare say his name," Grace cut him off. "You lost that right." The heightened voices drew neighbors to peek out their windows. "Grace, please," James pleaded. "I know I screwed up, but Noah, he's my son, isn't he?" Grace closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. When she opened them again, tears shimmered in her eyes. "Yes," she finally admitted. "Noah is your biological son, the son you left before you even knew he existed." James felt the weight of her words hit him. "I didn't know," he whispered. "If I had known." "What?" Grace snapped. "You would have stayed. Don't kid yourself, James. You made your decision 10 years ago." James took a step forward. "Let me see him, please. I know I don't deserve it, but—" "No." Grace's voice was almost a shout. "You're right, you don't deserve it. Noah has a good life and a family who loves him. I won't let you mess that up." Just then, a car pulled up. Chris got out, his eyes darting between the visibly upset Grace and the stranger standing nearby in a suit. "Is everything all right, honey?" Chris asked, slipping an arm protectively around Grace. James felt a sharp pang of jealousy. This man was living the life that should have been his. "It's fine," Grace replied, still glaring at James. "He was just leaving." Chris glanced between them, sensing the tension in the air. "Do you two know each other?" he asked, his confusion growing. Before Grace could reply, a school bus came to a halt at the corner. Noah stepped off, walking toward them. Panic seized Grace. "James, you need to leave. Now." Without hesitation, James ducked behind a tree, his heart racing as he watched Noah approach. The boy was a mirror image of himself as a child. "Mom? Is everything okay?" Noah asked, noticing how unsettled Grace looked. She forced a smile. "Everything's fine, honey. Let's head inside, all right? Chris will help you with your homework." Noah walked inside, with Chris following behind, giving a last puzzled glance toward where James was hiding. Grace stayed behind. "Go away, James," she whispered firmly. "Don't come back. Please." James emerged from behind the tree, heartbroken. "Grace, No," she cut him off. "You have no idea what we've been through, what Noah has been through. I can't let you ruin everything now." With that, Grace turned and went inside, shutting the door with finality. James stood on the sidewalk, lost and heartbroken. He had just seen his son, so close, yet unreachable. Inside, Grace leaned against the door, trembling. Chris appeared in the hallway, concern etched on his face. "Grace?" "Who was that?" he asked. Grace looked at him, the man who had been her rock in the storm these past few years. He deserved the truth. "That was James," she said, her voice breaking. "Noah's father." Chris's face drained of color. "What? But how?" Chris started to ask, bewildered. Grace took a deep breath. "It's a long story, one I hoped I'd never have to tell." Meanwhile, James returned to his car, devastated but determined. He had made the biggest mistake of his life 10 years ago, and now he had to find a way to make it right, no matter how difficult it would be. James's guilt and regret kept him awake that night in his hotel room. Painful memories flooded his mind. He remembered himself and Grace 5 years before he left. Grace had excitedly told him about a promotion opportunity at her school. "That's great, honey," James had said absent-mindedly, never looking up from his newspaper. "But don't get too ahead of yourself. It's just an elementary school." Grace's smile had faded. Another memory surfaced, Grace suggesting they start saving so she could go back to school for a master's degree. James chuckled. "Why bother? It's not like teaching kids to color is going to make you rich." Fast forward to the present, and James feels a sharp pang of guilt twisting inside him. How could he have been so oblivious, so thoughtless? Over at the Maple Street house, Grace and Chris were having a quiet conversation in the kitchen after Noah had gone to bed. "Do you think we should tell him?" Chris asked softly. Grace sighed, rubbing her tired eyes. "I don't know. He deserves to know, but what if it hurts him? What if James disappears again?" Chris pulled her into a comforting embrace. The next morning, Noah came downstairs for breakfast and found Chris alone in the kitchen. "Where's Mum?" Noah asked, yawning. "She had to leave early," Chris replied, setting pancakes on Noah's plate. Noah absent-mindedly poked at his food, looking deep in thought. "Chris, can I ask you something?" "Of course, buddy." "It's about my real dad." Chris's hand stopped midair, coffee mug in hand. "What do you want to know?" "Why did he leave? Didn't he like me?" Chris's heart sank, seeing Noah's vulnerable expression. "No, it wasn't like that. It's complicated. But it has nothing to do with you. Okay?" Noah nodded, though he didn't seem entirely convinced. Outside, James stood by the window, watching the warm exchange between Chris and Noah, feeling like an outsider looking in. His chest tightened with longing. After Noah left for school, James made his move. As the boy walked by, James casually approached. "Hey kid, is this your ball?" he asked, holding up a soccer ball. Noah eyed him suspiciously. "No." "Oh, I thought it might have rolled out from your yard. Do you play?" "Sometimes with Chris," Noah said, easing up a bit. James felt a pang of envy. "That's cool. I used to play a lot when I was your age." They chatted for a few minutes. James clung to every second, trying to burn the image of his son's face into his memory. "I've got to go," Noah finally said. "I'm going to be late for school." Right. It was good talking to you, Noah." Reluctantly, James watched him run off, his heart filled with both joy and sorrow. Meanwhile, at a lavish suburban mansion, Rachel had finally gotten a lead on James's location. She hired a private investigator who quickly unearthed the shocking truth. "A son?" Rachel spat, her eyes flashing dangerously. "That idiot has a kid he never told me about?" Rachel paced the spacious, elegantly decorated room, her thoughts racing. Suddenly, everything made sense. James's odd behavior, his sudden disappearance. A cruel smile tugged at her lips. "So that's your choice, huh? Trade your life of luxury for a school teacher and her kid." Rachel picked up her phone and quickly dialed a familiar number. "Mr. Johnson, I need more information on that boy. Noah, right? Find out everything you can." She paused for a second. "And get the divorce papers ready. I'm going to need them soon." She hung up, already plotting her next move. If James thought he could just walk away from her and the wealth they built together, he was in for a rude awakening. Rachel wasn't one to let go without a fight, and she always fights to win. Grace hadn't slept much, tossing and turning all night. By morning, with heavy bags under her eyes, she'd made up her mind. Noah needed to know the truth. "Noah, sweetie, can we talk?" she called to him after breakfast. Once they were seated on the couch, she took a deep breath. "Remember when you asked about your father?" Noah nodded, his curiosity piqued. "Well, there's something I need to tell you," Grace began, her voice shaking. "Your father, he's in town. He wants to meet you." Noah's eyes widened in shock. "What? He's alive?" Grace explained everything. How James had left her, how she found out she was pregnant afterward. With every word, Noah's emotions shifted from shock to confusion, and then anger. "He just left us. And now he wants to meet me. No way, I don't want to see him," he yelled, jumping to his feet. "Noah, please, try to understand," Grace pleaded. Understand what? That my real dad is a coward. Noah stormed off, slamming the door to his room. Grace collapsed onto the couch, tears spilling down her face. She knew it would be hard, but the anger in Noah's eyes shattered her. Meanwhile, James finally faced Rachel at her lavish mansion. "Why are you here?" Rachel asked, her voice icy. "Shouldn't you be off playing house with your little secret family?" James was taken aback. "How did you... "Oh, sweetheart," Rachel interrupted with a bitter laugh. "I always know everything. The real question is, what are you going to do now?" James took a deep breath. "I'm here to tell you it's over, Rachel. I can't live this lie anymore." Rachel's face contorted in rage. "You think you can just walk away from me? After everything I've done for you," she spat. "What you did was manipulate me," James shot back. "You pushed me to chase ambition and leave Grace behind." "And you followed right along," Rachel sneered. "Don't act like a victim, James. You chose wealth and power. I just pointed you in the right direction." A wave of guilt washed over James. She wasn't wrong. He had made those decisions on his own. "Well, I'm making a different choice now," he said, turning to go. "If you walk out that door," Rachel warned, her voice icy, "I'll expose all your dirty dealings, every backroom deal, every bribe. You'll lose everything." James froze, her threat hanging in the air. He knew she wasn't bluffing. Meanwhile, back at Grace's place, Chris returned from work to find her still trembling on the couch. "What happened?" he asked, worry lining his face. Grace recounted her conversation with Noah, her voice shaky. Chris embraced her, but she could feel the tension in his body. "Do you think I did the right thing?" she asked, uncertainty creeping into her voice. Chris hesitated. "I think so. But what now? Is James going to be part of our lives?" There was fear in his tone. "He's Noah's father, Chris, but you're the one who's always been here." Chris nodded, though the unease between them was palpable. That night, James roamed the streets, his mind racing. Rachel's threats mixed with haunting memories of his past. Flashbacks of moments he'd dismissed Grace's dreams of furthering her education. Times he'd neglected her emotional needs, obsessed with climbing the ladder of success. The realization hit hard. His selfishness had destroyed his marriage and stolen precious moments with his son. Standing outside Grace's house, James caught a glimpse of Noah's bedroom light flicking off. His son was so close, yet felt so distant. "I'm sorry," he whispered into the night, "for everything." James knew he had a long, painful journey ahead, facing Rachel's wrath, making amends for his mistakes, and trying to regain the trust of Grace and Noah. But for the first time in years, he felt resolved to do what was right, no matter the consequences. With one last glance at the house, James turned and walked down the dark streets of Chicago, ready to face the fallout of his actions and fight for a place in his son's life. The weight of guilt was overwhelming, yet the longing to reconnect with Noah pushed him forward. It was as if he were a ship lost at sea, tossed around with no compass to guide him. One day, James noticed Noah leaving school. Acting on impulse, he approached. "Hey Noah, remember me? The guy with the soccer ball," James said, with a nervous grin. Noah gave him a wary glance. "Yeah. What do you want?" "I just wanted to see how you were doing," James replied, his voice stumbling as he realized how awkward he sounded. "I'm fine," Noah said shortly, before quickly moving away. James stood frozen, feeling like a fool. Later, in his hotel room, for the first time in years, James broke down, the weight of his failure as a father crashing down on him. From afar, Grace observed James's clumsy attempts. Part of her wanted to yell at him to stay away, to protect Noah from further pain. But another part, one she hardly recognized, felt sympathy for James. "He's trying to reach out to you," Grace mentioned to Noah one evening. Noah's brow furrowed. "Why now?" "He didn't care before." Grace sighed deeply. "People make mistakes, honey. Sometimes, really big ones." "He hurt you," Noah muttered, his voice thick with a mix of anger and sorrow. Grace hugged him tightly, her heart breaking for the hurt in his eyes. Meanwhile, Chris sensed a shift in their lives and made a decision. One night, under a sky full of stars, Chris took Grace to a cozy dinner. As the evening wound down, he got down on one knee, holding out a ring. "Grace," he said softly, "will you marry me?" Tears filled Grace's eyes. She loved Chris. He was dependable and safe. But his proposal, amidst the storm of emotions surrounding her, took her by surprise. "I need some time," she whispered, noticing the disappointment clouding Chris's face. A few days later, Noah was riding his bike down the street when a car suddenly sped around the corner. From a distance, James acted on instinct, sprinting forward. He shoved Noah out of harm's way, and they both tumbled onto the grass. "You all right?" James asked breathlessly, his heart pounding. Noah, shaken but unharmed, nodded slowly. "Thanks," he murmured, looking at James with a blend of caution and wonder. James wanted so badly to embrace him, to tell him he was his father and that he loved him. But instead, he quietly helped Noah to his feet. Meanwhile, Rachel was planning her next move. She enlisted private investigators to dig deep into James's life, determined to uncover any dirt she could use against him. "Find out everything about his business for the past decade," she demanded over the phone. "Every dollar, every deal. I want to ruin him." Completely unaware of Rachel's plot, James spent restless nights replaying every choice that had led him here. Staring at his tailored suits and high-end watches, he felt nothing but shame. One evening, as he wandered through the city, James paused outside a toy store. In the window display, a wooden train, identical to the one from his childhood, caught his eye. Tears welled up as he remembered all of Noah's birthdays he had missed. Right then, James made up his mind. He couldn't change the past, but he could fight for a better future. Even if Grace and Noah never fully forgave him, he'd do whatever it took to be part of his son's life again. With fresh determination, James returned to his hotel. He picked up the phone, knowing the call he was about to make could change everything. "Fred, it's James. I need your help to clear up some legal issues. It's time to settle the score with the past." As the night settled over Chicago, James felt like he was standing in the calm before the storm. The worst was yet to come, but for the first time in ages, he was ready to face the fallout from his choices, no matter the cost. The truth, like a ticking time bomb, finally blew up one Sunday afternoon. Noah, coming back from a walk in the park, saw James talking with Grace on the porch. In that instant, everything clicked. The man with the soccer ball, the stranger who saved him from the accident, that was his dad. "Is it him? Is it?" Noah yelled, racing toward them. "It's my dad!" Grace and James stood there, stunned. "Noah, I can explain," Grace began, but Noah was already crying. "Why did you lie? Why did you let him come near me?" he shouted, his voice full of pain and anger. James stepped forward. "Noah, this is on me. Your mum was only trying to protect you." Noah stared at him, eyes brimming with hurt. "You left us. Why come back now?" The difficult conversation dragged on for hours, with Noah swinging between anger and tears, Grace doing her best to calm things down, and James being forced to confront the painful realities of his past. All the while, in his office, James prepared to make the hardest decision of his life. He grabbed the phone, his hands shaking. "Mr. Johnson, this is James Wilson. I need to come clean about some unethical business practices I've been involved in over the years. James knew this could mean the end of his wealth, maybe even jail time, but he couldn't carry the burden of his secrets anymore. Over at Grace's place, Chris showed up in the middle of the chaos. When he saw James there, his face tightened with anger. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice strained. Grace, worn out, emotionally and physically, pulled Chris aside. "Chris, I can't marry you." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Chris flinched as if he had been hit. "Is this about him?" he asked, pointing toward James. "No," Grace answered honestly. "It's about me. And Noah. We've got too much to sort through from the past. I can't bring you into this mess." Chris, confused and hurt, left. Grace was heartbroken, but also felt a strange sense of relief. The next morning, James's life fell apart. Headlines blasted, "Business tycoon confesses to fraud." Rachel, furious about James's confession, leaked everything she could to the media. Reporters swarmed Grace's house, shouting questions about James and Noah. Horrified, Grace tried to keep Noah away from the frenzy. "Mum, why are they here?" Noah asked, scared. "It's complicated, sweetie," Grace said, pulling the curtains closed. "But it'll pass." Meanwhile, stuck in his hotel room, James watched his world crumble. His assets were frozen, business partners were abandoning him, and prison seemed more likely by the minute. Desperate, he called Grace. "I'm sorry," he blurted out as soon as she answered. "I know," Grace sighed, "but this has impacted us. What are we supposed to do now?" Guilt consumed James as he closed his eyes. "I'll make it right, Grace," he promised. Somehow. That night, as the flash of cameras lit up the street outside, Grace sat with Noah in his room. "Noah, I know this is tough," she began, "but your dad is trying to do the right thing now." Noah was quiet for a moment before asking, "Is he going to jail?" Grace felt her heart tighten. "I don't know, honey, but no matter what, we'll stick together, okay?" Meanwhile, James faced the harsh reality of losing everything. But for the first time in years, he felt a strange sense of peace. The truth came at a steep cost, but it was one James was prepared to pay for the chance to reconnect with his son. Alone in his hotel room, he picked up the phone, steeling himself for what was to come. He couldn't avoid it any longer. "Hello? This is James Wilson. I'm ready to turn myself in," he said, the weight of his decision settling in. Early in the morning, Grace entered Noah's room to wake him, only to freeze in shock. His bed was empty, and the window was wide open. A crumpled note on the nightstand read, "I need time to think. Don't come looking for me." Panic surged through her as she dialed James's number. "Noah's gone," she cried the moment he answered. James's heart dropped, the room spinning. "I'm coming now," he said, already bolting out the door. When he arrived, he found Grace on the porch, tears streaming down her face. Their past vanished for a split second, and their son's well-being took its place. "We'll find him," James reassured her, gripping her hands. Together, they combed through the city, retracing every park and street Noah frequented. With each passing hour, their fear deepened. What if something happens to him? Grace's voice quivered, barely audible. James clenched his jaw. "We won't let that happen. We can't give up." As they continued searching, memories of the past flooded their minds. Grace recalled the days James and Noah played in the backyard before everything fell apart. James remembered cradling Noah for the first time in the hospital, the love that filled him, and the fear that drove him away. By late afternoon, Chris showed up, out of breath. "I got here as fast as I could. How can I help?" he asked. Grace looked at him, surprised but thankful. Despite it all, Chris still cared. "Thank you," she whispered, resting her hand on his arm for a moment. The three of them split up, trying to cover more ground. As night fell, the air turned colder, their anxiety growing. It was James who finally found a sign. In the old park where he used to bring Grace years ago, he spotted a solitary figure on the swings. "Noah?" James called softly, approaching cautiously. Noah glanced up, his eyes swollen from crying. "Why did you come back?" he asked, voice hoarse. "Why now?" James sat down on the swing beside him, feeling the weight of his regret. "Because leaving was the worst thing I've ever done. Not a day goes by that I haven't regretted it." Noah stayed quiet for a while. "You hurt Mum. You left us," he finally said, his words thick with pain. "I know," James whispered, tears welling in his eyes. "And there's no way I can undo the past. But I'm here now, trying to make things right. Even if you can never forgive me, I want you to know, Noah, that I love you. I always have." Just then, Grace and Chris came rushing over. "Noah!" Grace cried out, wrapping her arms around him tightly. Their reunion was interrupted as Rachel stormed in. "So this is it," she yelled at James. "You're throwing away everything we built for this sad little family." James stood tall, stepping between Rachel and the others. "Enough, Rachel. It's over." "Over?" Rachel scoffed bitterly. "You're going to lose it all, James. Your money, your freedom. For what?" James glanced at Grace and Noah before turning back to Rachel. "For something money can't buy. Family. Real love." Rachel, seething with rage, moved toward them, but Chris stepped in, blocking her path. "I think it's time for you to go," he said, his voice steady. Outnumbered, Rachel shot them one last hateful look before leaving. Silence filled the air, thick with tension. James turned to Grace, Noah, and Chris, his voice breaking as he spoke. "I'm sorry. For everything. For what I did in the past, and for the mess I've made now. I'll turn myself in tomorrow." Noah, surprising everyone, stepped forward. "You're going to jail?" James nodded, the weight of his choices heavy on his shoulders. "Most likely. I did bad things, Noah, and I have to face the consequences." Noah glanced at Grace, then back at James. "But what if I want to get to know you?" James's heart swelled. "I'd love that more than anything," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I understand. If you don't want to." With tears in her eyes, Grace hugged Noah. "It's up to you, honey. We'll be here for you no matter what." And under the old park's stars, the fractured pieces of their family began to mend. It wouldn't be simple. There was still much to fix, and forgiveness would take time. But for the first time in years, there was hope. As James, Grace, and Noah hugged, their embrace was filled with sorrow, regrets, and most importantly, love. From a short distance away, Chris looked on, a bittersweet smile on his face, knowing deep down he had done the right thing. The road ahead was uncertain, but at least that night, they had each other. And for now, that was enough. The judge's gavel hit the bench, sealing James's fate in the courtroom. Found guilty of financial fraud, he was handed a 2-year prison sentence and ordered to repay all the money he had unlawfully gained. Surprisingly, James took the ruling with a calmness that caught everyone off guard. To him, it was a fair consequence for his actions. Over the following months, James used his time behind bars to reflect and think about his future. He signed up for business ethics courses and started brainstorming ways to help small businesses once he got out. True to her promise, Grace made sure Noah visited James in prison. At first, their visits were awkward and strained, but gradually, father and son started building a real connection. "How was school this week?" James would ask, genuinely interested. Noah, hesitant at first, slowly began to open up. "I had a math test. I think I did okay." James smiled, proud. "I'm sure you did great. You're a smart kid, Noah." As time passed, their conversations grew deeper. Noah asked difficult questions about the past, and James answered with honesty, no matter how painful it was. Grace watched the growing bond between them with a mix of worry and hope. She made it clear where the boundaries were, ensuring James knew his place in Noah's life. "He needs you as a father," Grace told James during one visit, "but I can't let him get hurt again." James nodded, understanding Grace's stance. "I get it. I'll do whatever it takes to be the dad Noah deserves." Meanwhile, life continued outside the prison. After a lot of reflection and honest talks, Grace and Chris decided to give their relationship another shot. On a sunny spring day, Grace walked down the aisle in a simple, beautiful dress, with Chris waiting at the altar, his eyes full of love. Noah, beaming with pride, carried the rings. James, still locked up, heard the news with mixed feelings. There was a hint of sadness, but mostly he felt relief, knowing Grace and Noah had found love and stability. When James was finally released, he was committed to living an honest life. Using his business background, he joined an NGO offering free consulting to small business owners. "I want to put my skills to good use now," he explained to Noah during one of their weekly park meetups. Noah, now 12, looked at his dad with newfound admiration. "That's awesome, Dad." The word dad still made James's heart skip a beat. It was a title he knew he had to work for every single day. Grace observed the changing family dynamics with care. She and Chris provided Noah with a stable, loving home, while James focused on being a committed and responsible father. A year after being released, James attended Noah's science fair at school. Standing next to Grace and Chris, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for being a part of his son's life, even though it wasn't how he originally envisioned. "I'm proud of you, son," James told Noah after the presentation. Noah beamed, giving James a hug, then turning to Grace and Chris for the same. It was a scene no one could have predicted just months ago. An unconventional family, yet bound together by their love for Noah. That evening, James reflected on his journey. He remembered how arrogant he used to be, and how he had once dismissed Grace's dreams and ambitions. Now, it was clear to him just how wrong he had been. "Thank you for giving me this chance," James said to Grace when she came to pick Noah up. Grace gave him a gentle nod. "You're trying, James," she replied. "Noah notices it. We all do." As he watched Grace and Noah walk away, James felt a kind of peace he had never known in all his years of wealth and success. He had lost a fortune, but gained something priceless, the chance to be a good father and a better man. The path ahead was still uncertain. There was so much to learn, so much to make right. But James was ready to move forward, taking it one day at a time, striving to become the best version of himself. That night, under the Chicago skyline, James made a quiet vow to himself, to Noah, to Grace, and to everyone he had ever hurt. He would live the rest of his life with honesty, kindness, and love. It was the least he could do to honor the second chance life had given him. And with hope in his heart and a fire in his soul, James walked back to his modest apartment, ready to take on whatever challenges tomorrow would bring. His journey of redemption wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, he was on the right track. I hope today's story touched your heart. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on more moving stories. Share this with your friends so they can feel inspired too, and tell us in the comments what you think. We'd love to hear your thoughts and suggestions to keep bringing you content that speaks to the soul.